welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Forgotten Night Shift. The night had already fallen over the old industrial complex, its rusty pipes and cracked windows casting long shadows in the dim streetlights. Jared had been working the night shift at the Mill Creek warehouse for just under a year. It was one of those jobs that didn't require much attention. Most of the time, he'd just sit at the front desk and monitor the security cameras or read through a stack of paperwork. The job was simple: patrol the grounds every hour, make sure nothing was out of place, and call the police if something seemed off. But every night, as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the weight of the silence and emptiness pressed in on him, making the hours feel longer than they really were. The warehouse was massive, built in the 1920s and still operating under the same blueprints. It had an old-world charm to it, with its iron beams, peeling paint, and the faint smell of oil and concrete. Once, it had been a thriving textile mill, but now, it stood empty, its hollowed out halls filled with forgotten crates and the ghostly remnants of long-dead industries. Only a few businesses rented out space, and most of them were warehouses for online companies. But some of the floors were vacant, and some were sealed off, either due to structural damage or because no one bothered with them anymore. Jared never liked working the late shift. Being alone in the vast expanse of empty rooms made the shadows seem deeper, the silence thicker. Still, he could handle it. He'd worked tougher jobs in his time and had learned to ignore the eerie feeling that always crept up on him after a few hours. The place was harmless, or so he thought. The first few hours of the night were always uneventful. Jared would patrol the first and second floors, check the stairwells, and monitor the fire exits. There were 2 security guards on duty, but only one of them, a guy named Carter, worked the graveyard shift. The other guy, Frank, was assigned to the security room, and he handled the cameras, which meant Jared could focus on the ground-level rounds. Around 11:30 p.m., Jared made his way toward the loading dock, where the last shipment of goods had arrived earlier that evening. He paused at the back of the building, staring out into the parking lot. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above him, casting an eerie glow over the cracked concrete. There was something about this spot that always felt wrong. It was too isolated, too distant from the main entrance. The sound of his boots echoing on the cold ground felt louder here, more amplified. He shook his head, brushing off the discomfort, and continued his patrol. By now, he was used to the sounds: creaking beams, gusts of wind through broken windows, the occasional scurrying of rats or stray cats. They didn't bother him. What bothered him more was the lingering thought that something in this building didn't belong, something that he couldn't quite place. And it was this feeling that gnawed at him as he reached the back stairwell, the one that led to the old, unused 3rd floor. The 3rd floor had been locked up for as long as Jared had been working there. Nobody ever went up there, except for the occasional maintenance worker who might need to check the air conditioning ducts or do minor repairs. But that was about it. The door was always locked. The hallway leading to it dark and narrow. The air always felt colder here, and Jared couldn't understand why. Maybe it was just the building's age, but there was something more, something unsettling about it. He didn't know why he'd decided to take the elevator this time. Maybe it was because it was quiet, or maybe he just wanted to see if he could find something new. He pressed the button for the 3rd floor and waited, tapping his fingers against the cool metal wall. The elevator creaked and groaned as it made its way upward, the lights flickering with each passing floor. When the doors finally opened, Jared hesitated for a moment, the familiar chill creeping down his spine. The third floor was nothing like the rest of the building. It was dimly lit by a few weak overhead bulbs, the walls lined with ancient boxes and crates, most of them covered in a thick layer of dust. The place smelled of mildew and old paper. Jared walked down the corridor, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath him. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights above and the occasional rattle from the old pipes running along the walls. As he rounded the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. There was something different about this floor tonight. At first, it was subtle, a faint scraping sound, like metal against metal, coming from the far end of the hallway. Jared froze, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. He keyed the mic, but there was nothing but static. He tried again, but the radio wouldn't work. His pulse quickened. He knew he should have turned back. The floor was always empty at night, and there was no reason for anyone to be here. But the sound, the scraping continued, followed by a soft thud. He crept toward the source, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out before him like an ominous tunnel, each step he took amplifying the sounds echoing off the walls. As he neared the end of the corridor, he saw something in the dim light. A door, one he didn't remember seeing before. It was ajar, just a crack, with a sliver of darkness visible inside. Jared's breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to leave. But something compelled him to move forward. He pushed the door open slowly, his hand trembling on the handle. Inside, the room was freezing cold, the temperature a stark contrast to the warmth of the hallway. The light flickered above, casting erratic shadows across the room. And there, in the center of the room, was a large, overturned filing cabinet, its drawers pulled out halfway. Jared didn't know why he felt a chill of dread wash over him, but he did. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, made his skin crawl. He stepped closer, the scraping sound now louder, more frantic. And then he saw it. A figure, pale and skeletal, hunched over in the corner of the room, its fingers dragging across the floor, scratching at something. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow in the dark. The figure's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The silence was deafening. Jared backed away slowly, his feet stumbling over the piles of broken boxes behind him. The figure's eyes followed him, its body jerking in unsettling movements. Without thinking, Jared turned and ran. He bolted down the hallway, his mind racing. What the hell was that thing? What was it doing in the building? His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he sprinted toward the elevator. But when he reached the doors, they wouldn't open. Panic surged through him. He tried the stairs, but the entire stairwell felt wrong. The air was thicker here, and every creak of the building felt like a warning. Something was coming. He finally made it to the fire exit, slamming the door open and stumbling into the parking lot. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. The next morning, Jared called in sick. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. His mind kept replaying the image of the pale figure, its hollow eyes staring at him from the darkness. He tried to rationalize it, maybe it was a trick of the light, a product of his exhaustion. But deep down, he knew what he had seen was real. The following week, Jared returned to work, but the building felt different. The walls seemed to whisper, and the air was thick with something he couldn't explain. When he mentioned the incident to his coworkers, most of them just laughed it off, dismissing it as stress or too much caffeine. But when he told the supervisor, the man's face turned pale, and he didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "The third floor, it's been off limits for years. Nobody's supposed to go up there anymore. You're lucky you got out." Jared didn't question him further. He didn't want to know the full story. But as the weeks went by, he couldn't shake the feeling that the thing from the third floor was still watching him. That something was waiting. Story: The Silent Watcher. I was 19 when I took the job. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep my head above water while I worked my way through college. The pay was decent for an entry-level security position, and the hours were flexible enough that I could fit in a full night's work between classes. It seemed like the perfect opportunity. The building was an old mansion located on the outskirts of town. It had been repurposed into a corporate office complex about 10 years ago. The kind of place that looked more like a haunted house than a functional workspace. The hallways were narrow and winding, with old wooden floors that creaked when you walked across them. The walls were adorned with dark, ornate wallpaper, and the lights flickered more often than not. The job itself was simple. I was hired to patrol the building at night, make sure no one had broken in, and keep an eye out for any troublemakers. A typical security gig. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt a strange chill in the air, like something was watching me. It wasn't just the cold temperature, it was something else, something harder to explain. Something that made me second-guess every shadow I passed and every sound I heard. The staff who worked during the day were all gone by 6 p.m., and after that, the building was left to its own devices. The complex was entirely empty, except for the janitor, who would come and go sporadically to clean up the offices and hallways. At night, the building was mine to roam. I was scheduled for the late shift on my first night. My supervisor, Dave, handed me a set of keys, showed me the monitor for the security cameras, and then left, reminding me that I'd be working alone. "Just make your rounds every hour," he said. "Check the rooms, make sure the doors are locked, and keep an eye on the monitors. If anything feels off, call me." I nodded, took the keys, and watched him leave through the front door. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him with an ominous finality. I began my rounds. The building had 3 floors, and the halls were sprawling, with countless rooms to check. The windows were covered with thick, dark curtains, blocking out most of the light, leaving the building to feel like a labyrinth in perpetual twilight. I started on the top floor, checking each door and ensuring everything was locked. The only sounds were the creaking of the floorboards under my feet and the faint hum of the security system. I noticed that some of the old portraits hanging on the walls seemed to stare at me as I passed. Their eyes, drawn with remarkable detail, followed me as I moved down the hall. It was just my imagination, I told myself, but the sensation unsettled me. By the time I reached the second floor, it was nearing 1 a.m. I decided to take a break in the security office to check the cameras and make sure everything was running smoothly. As I sat down at the desk, I glanced at the monitor and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the screen, was a figure standing in the hallway of the first floor. At first, I thought it was just another glitch in the system, but as I zoomed in, I realized it wasn't. The figure was tall, wearing a long coat that blended into the shadows. Its face was obscured by a wide, brimmed hat. It stood motionless in the hallway, just watching. My heart raced. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and called Dave, but the radio was dead. It was as if the entire building had gone silent. No hum of the air conditioning, no sounds of distant footsteps, just an eerie quiet. I sat frozen in the security office for a few moments, watching the figure on the screen. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, as if waiting for something. I knew I should investigate, but my legs felt like lead. I took a deep breath and steeled myself. Slowly, I stood up from the desk and grabbed the flashlight. I couldn't let the figure go unchecked. If someone was inside, I needed to know who it was. The building was enormous, and the hallway where the figure stood seemed to stretch on forever. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I crept down the hall toward the staircase that led to the first floor. The building felt oppressive, suffocating almost, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I reached the first floor, I turned the corner and shined my flashlight down the hallway. There was no one there. The figure had vanished. I checked every room, every closet, every corner, but the first floor was empty. I couldn't explain it. I returned to the security office, checking the cameras again. The figure was gone from the monitor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was just after 3 a.m. when I took the elevator down to the basement. There were no cameras in the basement, and it was often where the building's utilities were stored, so it was part of my rounds. The elevator creaked as it descended, its doors sliding open with an eerie metallic groan. The basement was dark and damp, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling. It smelled like mildew and dust. I walked past the storage rooms and maintenance areas, keeping an eye on the shadows. There was a narrow, dimly lit hallway at the far end of the basement that led to a single door. I had been told never to go in there. It was a storage area that had been locked off for years. The contents unknown. I was almost to the door when I heard something behind me. It was faint at first, like footsteps echoing down the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around, but there was no one there. I walked a few steps back toward the elevator. But the footsteps followed me. It wasn't until I reached the elevator that I turned around. Again. The hallway was empty. But the feeling of being watched remained. I returned to the first floor and resumed my rounds, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. My nerves were frayed, and every creak of the building seemed louder than before. I was exhausted, but I still had another few hours to go. It wasn't until I passed the main lobby that I saw it. A figure, standing just inside the entrance, facing the door. It wasn't the same figure I had seen earlier. This one was different, taller, thinner, and its face was pale, almost sickly, with hollow eyes. It turned toward me slowly, and I froze, my body paralyzed by fear. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching me with those empty eyes. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I backed away, slowly at first, then faster as the figure took a step toward me. I turned and ran, hearing the echo of footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. I made it to the elevator, my heart racing. I hit the button, and the doors opened. As the elevator ascended, I glanced toward the lobby one last time. The figure was gone. When I left the building at the end of my shift, I never came back. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. I didn't think they would believe me. I didn't even know if I believed it myself. But after that, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me. I'd catch glimpses of something in the corners of my eyes, just out of reach, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. A few weeks later, I saw a news article about the old building. It had been bought and renovated into luxury apartments. They'd discovered a strange hidden door in the basement. When they opened it, they found old photographs of the building's original owner, a man who had disappeared decades ago under mysterious circumstances. I haven't been back to the building since. But sometimes, when I pass by the apartments, I feel a cold shiver run down my spine. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the footsteps behind me. Story: The fog over Hawthorne. It was an unusually cold November evening when I first set foot at Hawthorne Shipping and Logistics. The company was one of the largest in the region, but its warehouse was an old, aging structure that still bore the marks of its early 20th century construction. While the building had been renovated over the years, the strange creaks of the wooden floors and the low hum of the industrial machines were enough to make anyone feel like they were walking in the footsteps of ghosts. But none of that bothered me, at least, not initially. My name is Lucas. I had just turned 24, and like many others, I found myself stuck in a job that barely paid the bills. I had graduated from college a year earlier, but with a degree in philosophy and no real direction, I ended up as a night security guard at Hawthorne's main warehouse. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and that was what I liked. It gave me time to think, read, and reflect on where my life was heading. Hawthorne Shipping sat on the outskirts of town, right by the edge of a vast forest. The whole area was known for its fog, especially in the fall. It rolled in thick and fast, like a heavy blanket, and would linger for hours, sometimes even days. As a child, I remembered hearing eerie stories about the fog, how it had claimed the lives of several drivers over the years. But in all my time at the warehouse, I'd never had much reason to be concerned. The fog was just another part of life here, and I had grown accustomed to it. The building itself was divided into two sections, the office area and the storage warehouse, which was where I was stationed most nights. I would walk the aisles, ensuring that all the loading docks were secure, checking the perimeter for any signs of unauthorized entry, and keeping an eye on the surveillance cameras. Most nights were uneventful. The occasional raccoon or stray cat might make its way into the building, but aside from that, there wasn't much to worry about. It was a little past midnight when I noticed the first unusual thing. The fog outside had grown especially dense, the kind of fog where even the streetlights were little more than dim halos. In the distance, I could hear the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows, but the stillness inside the warehouse was almost unnerving. The building felt alive in a strange way, like it was holding its breath. As part of my regular rounds, I had to inspect the fire exits and the main loading bay. The security system had a regular schedule, so I'd just check the cameras for any breaches, walk through the warehouse, and return to the office to finish up my report. But that night, something was different. As I walked down the long aisle toward the far corner of the building, I could swear I heard someone whispering. It was soft at first, like a breeze carrying some far-off conversation. But as I stopped and listened, the whispering grew louder, sharper. Almost as if someone was just out of sight, hiding in the fog. I didn't think much of it at first. It could have been the wind or the sound of the building settling. But then, something caught my eye, movement, something in the distance, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. I turned toward it, heart pounding, but all I saw was the same row of empty shelves, the same machinery that had been sitting untouched for hours. I told myself I was just imagining things and continued with my rounds, but my unease was building. The whispering hadn't stopped. When I reached the far end of the warehouse, the area where the old refrigerated units stood, I noticed something odd. The air was colder here than anywhere else in the building. Not just chilly but freezing, like standing in a deep freezer. The hairs on my neck stood up as I walked deeper into the space, the fog creeping under the door frames, thickening as I advanced. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't normal to hear nothing in this place. The silence felt oppressive, like the whole world had gone still, like something was watching me. I turned quickly, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Then I heard a door creaking open, just beyond my line of sight. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio on my belt. My voice was tight as I called into the front office. "Hey! Is anyone else in here?" Silence. There was no answer, just static. I keyed the radio again, but this time, I could hear something on the other end, a slow, almost imperceptible breath. My hand tightened on the radio as I stepped cautiously toward the door that had just opened. The fog was thick now, almost suffocating. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. My heart raced as I approached the door, and that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the empty rows of shelves and the pale, dim light filtering through the fog. I cursed under my breath and began to back away slowly, my mind racing. My senses were on high alert now, and I could feel the hairs on my neck standing up as I made my way back toward the exit. Every step I took was measured, careful. The footsteps behind me followed, echoing on the concrete floor. As I neared the front of the building, I noticed something else. The door that I had left ajar when I entered had closed. Not just closed, but locked. I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic started to set in as I scrambled for my keys, only to find that they were missing from my belt. My hand shook as I patted my pockets, but they weren't there. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to move, my thoughts spinning. Something wasn't right. This place, it was like it had turned against me, trapping me inside with no way out. I could feel the temperature dropping, the fog seeping in through every crack and crevice. The whispering started again, but this time, it was louder. More insistent. Almost like a chant. "Leave, leave, leave." The voices repeated. I turned quickly, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just the shelves, the empty pallets, and the growing fog. My breath came out in visible puffs as I backed away from the door. I had to get out. I had to leave. The moment I turned toward the back of the warehouse, I heard a loud bang, like something heavy being dropped. My heart skipped a beat as I spun back toward the noise. But there was no one. The place was empty, just as it had been when I first arrived. Except now, it felt different. It felt wrong. I rushed back toward the front office, where I knew the emergency exit was. The whole building seemed to pulse with the fog now, like it was alive, like it was closing in on me. As I reached the stairs leading to the office, I glanced behind me and saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow stood at the far end of the warehouse, watching me. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, its eyes following me as I climbed the stairs. I didn't stop until I reached the top, where I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My hands were shaking as I tried to get a grip on my phone. The signal was dead. For what felt like hours, I sat there in the dark office, listening to the silence around me. The whispering had stopped, but I still felt it. Someone or something was watching. I didn't leave the office until dawn, when the first rays of sunlight began to break through the fog. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fog was still there, lingering in the corners of my mind. And that shadow, the one I had seen watching me, never left. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it standing just beyond the edge of the fog. Story echoes in the walls. It was one of those jobs that didn't seem too bad on paper. I had recently moved to the small town of Trenton Falls, a quiet place tucked away in the mountains, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. I had a job offer working night shifts as a security guard for the old and abandoned St. Agnes Hospital. The pay wasn't great, but for someone like me, who had just graduated college and was still trying to figure out what came next, it was enough to get by. The hospital had been closed for almost a decade, the result of a scandal involving malpractice lawsuits that had brought the once thriving institution to its knees. Over the years, the building had slowly deteriorated, its once pristine walls now marred by time and neglect. The owners had turned it into a kind of memorial, leasing it to a private company that offered paranormal investigations for the brave, or foolish, at heart. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts. Hell, I hadn't believed in much of anything for a while, not since I'd lost my mother and had to come to terms with the fact that life could change in an instant. But there was something about the eerie quiet of St. Agnes Hospital at night that rattled me. It wasn't the creaks in the floorboards or the distant sound of pipes groaning under pressure. No, it was something more insidious, something intangible, like the very air around me was charged with a heavy presence, as though the walls themselves were alive and watching. My shifts were supposed to run from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Most nights, it was just me, walking the empty halls with nothing but the dim glow of the security cameras and the occasional flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead to guide me. I'd check the main floors, make sure everything was locked up tight, and then head down to the basement, where the company stored their equipment. The place was cold and damp, and the only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system. The first strange thing happened a week into my job. It was around 2 a.m., and I was walking through the East Wing, an old part of the building that had once housed the pediatric ward. The hallways were narrow, the tiles cracked and stained, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. I had just passed room 218 when I heard a soft sound, like a child's laugh, echoing down the hall. I froze. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was distinct, the kind of innocent giggle that made you shiver. I walked toward the sound, telling myself it was just the building settling, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When I reached the doorway of room 218, I paused. The door was slightly ajar, and the faintest sliver of light from the hallway reflected off the dust-covered floors inside. I pushed it open with a trembling hand. There was nothing in the room. I stepped inside, trying to shake off the sudden chill that had spread through my body. The room was completely empty, save for a few old chairs and a tattered hospital bed. The faint scent of antiseptic still lingered in the air, but there was no sign of anyone, no child, no figure in the corner, nothing to explain the laughter. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to convince myself I was just hearing things. But then, from the far corner of the room, I saw it. A small object, what looked like an old stuffed bear, lay on the floor. I hadn't seen it when I entered, and there was no way it had been there before. I bent down to pick it up, and as my fingers brushed against the worn fabric, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. My breath fogged in front of me, and for a moment I thought I saw something in the corner of my vision, a fleeting shadow, moving just out of sight. I immediately stood up, my heart racing. I didn't know what to make of it. Was I imagining things? Was it stress? Sleep deprivation? I quickly left the room and headed down to the basement to shake off the unsettling feeling. But I couldn't stop thinking about that laugh. It echoed in my head for the rest of my shift. The second incident happened a few nights later, and this time, it was much worse. It was almost 4 a.m., and I was doing my usual rounds when I came across the hospital's old emergency room. The lights flickered as I approached, casting long shadows across the tile floor. I heard a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone tapping their fingers against a surface. I turned the corner and saw it. The door to the emergency room was wide open, and inside, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved. A man, or at least what appeared to be a man, stood in the center of the room. His back was to me, and his head was tilted slightly forward, as though he was listening intently to something. He was tall, unnaturally tall, and his limbs seemed slightly too long, stretching almost grotesquely. He was dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, stained with what looked like blood. I took a step back, my heart racing. The figure didn't seem to notice me, but I could feel something in the air, a tension, an electric charge, like it knew I was there. The door slammed shut, and the lights flickered again. I stood frozen, unable to move, unsure whether I should run or confront whatever this was. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to turn and sprint down the hall toward the security office. I locked the door behind me and sat there, panting, staring at the monitor screens, my eyes darting from one empty hallway to the next. The hospital had a strange, oppressive feeling at night, and now it was like something was aware of me. Something that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The final encounter happened during my last shift at St. Agnes Hospital. It was around 5 a.m., and I was on the third floor, making sure all the windows were locked before heading back to the security office. The place was completely silent, but that feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I was walking past room 307 when I noticed something unusual. The door to the room was wide open. I was sure I had checked it earlier, but now, the door was ajar, the light from the hallway spilling in. I stepped inside. The room was empty, but there was something on the bed. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I stepped closer, I saw it more clearly. It was a woman, lying in the bed, her face obscured by long, dark hair. She wore an old hospital gown, and her hands were folded neatly on her chest. I felt a chill run down my spine. The air in the room had grown cold, and the smell of decay seemed to linger. I reached out to touch her shoulder, to check if she was real, but just as my hand was about to make contact, she turned her head. Her eyes were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to stare into me with an unearthly gaze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a faint, gurgling noise, like someone trying to scream but unable to do so. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for certain: I needed to get out of there. I ran out of the room, down the hall, and out of the building. When I reached my car, I couldn't stop shaking. I drove straight home, not looking back. I never returned to St. Agnes Hospital after that night. The events that happened at St. Agnes stayed with me for a long time. Sometimes, I'd hear that woman's gurgling scream in my dreams, and sometimes, I'd see those hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness. But one thing I've come to realize is that no matter how much we try to understand what we can't explain, there are some things better left unknown. The hospital is still there, rotting away in the shadows of the reservation, waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to step inside. And maybe, just maybe, some things never truly leave. They just wait in the walls, in the dark corners, in the spaces between the living and the dead. Waiting, just waiting. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.